Financial pressure on powerful business figures rarely begins with dramatic scenes. It starts quietly, through court rulings, compliance deadlines, and decisions that test whether legal outcomes will be accepted or resisted. What makes this moment stand out is not the size of the assets involved, but the transition from courtroom judgment to real-world enforcement. For years, legal disputes around major business organizations often remained abstract, discussed in filings and appeals that most people never see. Once enforcement begins, however, those disputes take on a different meaning. Court decisions stop being theoretical and start shaping control, valuation, and ownership in concrete ways. That shift forces difficult questions about credibility, accountability, and how the legal system treats even the most well-known figures. This situation is drawing attention not because it is unprecedented, but because it illustrates how legal pressure operates when courts move from words to action. It highlights the gap between public image and legal reality, and why enforcement is often the most consequential phase of any civil case. Legal pressure in major business cases is often misunderstood because it unfolds far from public view. When a court issues a civil judgment, the ruling itself is only one step in a longer process. What follows is a question of compliance. Will the losing party satisfy the judgment voluntarily, secure a legal pause, or face enforcement? For large business holdings, that distinction matters enormously. In business terms, enforcement is the moment when legal consequences become operational. It is when courts move from evaluating past conduct to ensuring obligations are met. This can involve oversight, restrictions, or temporary control measures designed to protect the value of assets while legal requirements are fulfilled. These steps are not punitive by default. They exist to make sure court decisions carry real effect rather than symbolic weight. For high-profile business owners, enforcement also exposes an important reality about scale. Size and visibility do not change the mechanics of civil law. Courts are concerned with risk, compliance, and the ability to satisfy judgments, not reputation or public standing. When obligations reach a certain magnitude, the system relies on established procedures to prevent delay or avoidance, regardless of who is involved. Another key factor is timing. Appeals are a normal part of civil litigation, but they do not automatically suspend enforcement. Legal systems are designed this way to balance fairness with accountability. Without enforcement mechanisms, a party could delay consequences indefinitely, weakening trust in judicial outcomes. This is why courts often require guarantees or safeguards while appeals proceed. From a business perspective, this stage can be destabilizing. Uncertainty around control or valuation can affect lenders, partners, and long-term planning. Even when operations continue, the presence of legal enforcement signals heightened risk. Markets, investors, and counterparties pay close attention because enforcement reflects confidence or lack of it in how obligations will be met. Understanding this context is essential. What appears sudden from the outside is usually the result of a structured process reaching its next phase. Enforcement does not rewrite the case, it enacts it. And once that phase begins, the conversation shifts away from arguments and toward outcomes. Courts do not move to enforcement lightly. That step usually reflects a judgment that has reached a point where delay creates more risk than resolution. In civil cases involving large financial stakes, the legal system is designed to prevent outcomes from existing only on paper. Enforcement ensures that a ruling has substance and that obligations are not postponed indefinitely. One of the core principles behind enforcement is balance. Courts recognize the right to appeal, but they also recognize the rights of those who prevailed at trial. To manage this tension, legal systems rely on safeguards that protect the judgment, while higher courts review the case. These safeguards are not judgments on guilt or innocence. They are risk management tools meant to preserve fairness. From a procedural standpoint, enforcement often begins when a court determines that no adequate protection is in place to secure the judgment. If the losing party cannot demonstrate a reliable way to satisfy the ruling should the appeal fail, the court may act to prevent assets from being shifted, diminished, or rendered inaccessible. This is especially important in cases where the judgment is substantial relative to available liquidity. Another reason courts proceed with enforcement is predictability. The legal system depends on consistent application of rules. If high-profile or wealthy defendants were routinely allowed to delay consequences without safeguards, it would undermine confidence in civil law as a whole. Enforcement signals that legal outcomes are not optional, even while further review is ongoing. For businesses, this phase can be challenging because it introduces oversight into areas that were previously managed privately. Decisions about asset use, transfers, or restructuring may face limits, not as punishment, but as protection. Courts aim to preserve value, not destroy it, ensuring that obligations can ultimately be met. Seen this way, enforcement is less about escalation and more about completion. It reflects a system moving from deliberation to execution. Once that transition occurs, the focus shifts away from legal arguments and toward practical realities: how assets are managed, how risks are contained, and how accountability is carried out in real terms. When legal enforcement intersects with large business holdings, the effects extend well beyond the courtroom. Complex organizations are built on networks of financing, partnerships, and long-term projections. Any change in asset control or oversight can ripple through those systems, altering how the business is perceived and how it functions day to day. One immediate impact is on valuation. Asset values are not just numbers on paper, they depend on confidence. Lenders, insurers, and investors assess risk continuously. When courts step in to supervise or restrict assets, it signals uncertainty about future control or liquidity. That uncertainty can influence refinancing terms, insurance coverage ands, or willingness of partners to engage in new deals. Brand credibility is another factor. For prominent business figures, public identity is often tied closely to perceived financial success. Legal enforcement challenges that image by shifting attention from marketing claims to independently verified assessments. Once valuations are scrutinized through legal processes, reputational narratives lose some of their influence, replaced by documented findings and formal oversight. Operational flexibility can also be affected. Businesses facing enforcement may encounter limits on asset transfers, restructuring, or expansion. These constraints are not designed to shut operations down, but to prevent actions that could weaken the ability to satisfy legal obligations. Still, even temporary limits can slow decision-making and complicate strategic planning. There is also a psychological dimension. Enforcement changes how internal stakeholders, executives, employees, and advisors approach risk. Caution increases and long-term plans may be reevaluated. External stakeholders often adopt a wait-and-see posture, which can freeze momentum at critical moments. Taken together, these effects illustrate why enforcement is such a pivotal stage. It doesn't merely respond to past conduct, it reshapes the future of a business organization. Once legal oversight becomes part of the operational environment, the conversation shifts from ambition and growth to stability and compliance. That shift can define the trajectory of even the most established enterprises. In high-stakes civil cases, legal strategy often focuses on delay, leverage, and narrative control. These approaches are common, especially when the financial consequences are significant. Lawyers may pursue multiple motions, appeals, and procedural arguments, not only to challenge a ruling, but to manage timing and pressure. From a strategic standpoint, extending the process can sometimes create room for negotiation or alternative outcomes. However, courts are attentive to the difference between legitimate legal advocacy and tactics that strain the system. When judges sense that procedure is being used primarily to avoid compliance rather than resolve legal questions, their response can become firmer. At that point, patience gives way to enforcement. The goal shifts from accommodating extended litigation to protecting the integrity of the court's decision. This is where legal reality diverges from legal strategy. While appeals and motions are allowed, they do not override the basic expectation that judgments will be honored. Courts are structured to ensure that the right to challenge a decision does not become a tool to indefinitely postpone responsibility. When safeguards are not met, enforcement becomes the system's corrective mechanism. Another limitation of strategy is that it operates within fixed rules. Legal arguments must align with established standards, not just persuasive messaging. Courts evaluate risk, precedent, and compliance, not public reaction. If strategies rely too heavily on external narratives rather than legal substance, they lose effectiveness once enforcement begins. At this stage, options narrow. Decisions become less about arguing interpretations and more about managing consequences. Legal teams may still pursue appeals, but those efforts unfold alongside active oversight rather than in place of it. The balance of control shifts from the defendant to the system itself. Ultimately, this phase highlights a simple truth about the legal process. Strategy can shape how a case unfolds, but it cannot replace outcomes. When rulings move into enforcement, the law asserts its final authority, transforming abstract disputes into practical obligations that must be addressed directly. When legal enforcement reaches this level, its implications extend beyond a single business or individual. Markets and institutions watch closely because such cases test whether legal rules apply consistently, regardless of status or influence. The outcome influences how confidence is built or lost across financial and legal systems. Market behavior is heavily shaped by predictability. Investors, lenders, and insurers rely on clear signals about risk and accountability. When courts demonstrate that judgments will be enforced without exception, it reinforces the idea that financial claims must be supported by verifiable reality. This consistency matters because markets function best when rules are applied evenly and outcomes are not negotiable through power or prominence. Public trust is also affected. High-profile enforcement actions shape how people view the fairness of institutions. When legal systems appear capable of holding powerful actors accountable, confidence in governance strengthens. When enforcement falters, skepticism grows, particularly around whether wealth or influence creates separate standards. There is also a deterrent effect. Enforcement sends a message that compliance is not optional and that legal findings carry real consequences. This discourages risky behavior and encourages greater transparency, not just among high-profile figures, but across the broader business landscape. Companies recalibrate practices when they see that oversight has teeth. At the same time, enforcement raises important questions about resilience. Institutions must balance firmness with stability, ensuring that accountability does not unintentionally disrupt economic systems. This is why enforcement is often structured to preserve value rather than destroy it, maintaining continuity while legal obligations are addressed. Viewed broadly, this stage represents a stress test for institutional credibility. How enforcement is carried out carefully, consistently, and within clear rules determines whether trust is reinforced or weakened. In that sense, the impact reaches far beyond the immediate case, shaping expectations about fairness and responsibility in the economic system. As legal pressure intersects with public life, reputational consequences become unavoidable. For business leaders whose influence extends beyond commerce into politics or culture, legal enforcement reshapes how credibility is measured. Public narratives built over decades can shift quickly when claims of success are tested against formal scrutiny and verified outcomes. Reputation, unlike branding, depends on consistency between image and reality. When courts and markets independently assess value, performance, or compliance, those findings often carry more weight than self-promotion. Legal enforcement introduces an external benchmark, one that is difficult to dismiss or reinterpret. For prominent figures, this can alter how supporters, critics, and neutral observers evaluate past claims. Politically, this creates a complex dynamic. Legal consequences do not automatically determine public support, but they influence perception. Voters and stakeholders may separate legal outcomes from political beliefs, yet repeated enforcement actions can erode confidence over time. The distinction between legal accountability and political loyalty becomes harder to maintain when tangible assets and documented findings are involved. There is also a long-term impact on influence. Legal oversight can limit flexibility, reduce negotiating power, and constrain future opportunities. Even if appeals continue, the presence of enforcement signals heightened risk, affecting partnerships, endorsements, and institutional relationships. Influence rooted in perceived strength becomes more fragile when oversight replaces autonomy. At the same time, this moment illustrates a broader principle. Legal accountability does not target status, it responds to conduct. When enforcement reaches prominent individuals, it reinforces the idea that public standing does not confer immunity. That message can reshape expectations about leadership responsibility and credibility across both business and political arenas. Ultimately, reputational consequences are not imposed by courts alone. They emerge from how facts, decisions, and outcomes align over time. Once enforcement begins, the story is no longer controlled by messaging. It is shaped by process, documentation, and results, forces that redefine influence in lasting ways. This situation underscores a fundamental reality about how accountability functions in complex systems. Courts, markets, and institutions operate on rules designed to convert decisions into outcomes. When those mechanisms activate, they reveal the difference between reputation and responsibility, between narrative and verification. What stands out is not the prominence of the individual involved, but the consistency of the process. Legal systems are built to move from judgment to enforcement when obligations are unmet. That transition is not a commentary on status or influence. It is a reflection of structure. Enforcement exists to ensure that legal conclusions carry weight beyond paperwork and appeals. For the public, this moment offers clarity about how accountability actually works. Legal pressure is not about symbolism, it is about alignment, aligning conduct with consequences and claims with evidence. When institutions follow through, they reinforce trust by demonstrating that outcomes are not optional and that process matters. For businesses and leaders alike, the lesson is broader. Success measured only by perception is fragile. Durable credibility depends on transparency, compliance, and the ability to withstand independent scrutiny. When those elements are missing, pressure accumulates until systems respond. In the end, this is less a story about collapse and more about enforcement doing what it is designed to do. The significance lies in the confirmation that rules apply consistently, even when doing so is uncomfortable or consequential. That consistency is what allows institutions to endure and what gives accountability its meaning over time.